Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome to Just One Man, the podcast taking the Bible stories you grew up with and taking them to an adult understanding to hopefully deepen your faith, connect some dots for you in the Bible, and helping you to see God's plan for your life and for the rest of us. Today, we are doing episode 4, and this is going to be our first part in covering Matthew chapters 27 and 28. We're going to be visiting a very familiar story to us, the story of Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. And as we jump into this, I hope that you will just try to reset some of your expectations. Set aside what you think you know as we go into this story. If you're like me, then you're probably going to learn some things that you didn't know before. Now, chapter 27, this moves into Jesus' second trial that is conducted by the Romans. Jesus has just spent a sleepless night. First, he's with his disciples at the Passover meal. Then he goes to the Garden of Gethsemane to pray. Then he's under arrest, and then he's at the Jewish trial. And that starts with Annas, who's one of the two high priests at the time, and then moves to Caiaphas. And these trials are just, they're total shams. They're garbage. They're nothing more than just some perversions of justice to find an innocent man guilty of false charges. But Jesus submits to this just for the purpose of keeping with the Father's will to sacrifice his Son for the sins of the world. So as the trial with Caiaphas ends, the Jewish authorities pronounce Jesus guilty, and they find him guilty of blasphemy, of all things, but hey, that was punishable by death, so they didn't really care. However, the Jewish people, they run into this little problem that the Romans, they don't allow the Jews to engage in capital punishment. So with that being said, the Jewish authorities, now they got to find a way to convince the Romans to put Jesus to death on their behalf. So the Jews charged Jesus with blasphemy, but I just got to tell you, the Romans couldn't care less about a man blaspheming the God of Israel. That not their concern. That wasn't punishable by death under Roman law. So the Jews got to accuse Jesus of a crime that would be punishable by death under Roman law. And it's kind of like that's where Matthew chapter 27 picks up. So it's, as we start to focus on the Romans, we're also going to see the way that the Jews manipulate the Roman authorities to get the outcome that they want. Now, just like the Jewish trials, the Roman trials, they take place in two different locations by two different people. First, Jesus stands before the Roman governor of the province of Judea, which was Pilate. And Pilate's the true power here. He ultimately condemns Jesus to death, but Pilate does try to wash his hand of the whole thing along the way, both literally and figuratively. And we also know at one point that Pilate does send Jesus to Herod Antipas, the supposed king of the Jews at the time. Now, the Jews, they despised him. He was an Edomite, which just means he was a descendant of Esau. So if you think back to that story where you have Jacob and Esau, Jacob gets renamed Israel, and you have the Israelites, which is the Jewish people, and then the descendants of Esau are the Edomites, and that's what Herod Antipas was. So the Jewish people didn't like him at all. Now, Pilate, he's kind of hoping that Herod's just going to deal with Jesus in some kind of way, leave Rome out of it, but in the end, Herod just ends up sending Jesus back to him. Now, Jesus' time before Herod, that's recorded in the book of Luke, so we're not going to get into that during this 6-week overview of this, but if you want to jump into Luke, you can kind of see the movements between Pilate and Herod there. Now, through this back and forth, the Jewish leaders, they're going to go with Jesus because, they got one mission. They're absolutely determined to see him die. And eventually we know they succeed in getting Pilate to give them what they want, even against his better judgment. But before looking at the Roman trial, Matthew comes back to this subject of Judas, the man who betrayed Jesus. That's where we pick up in verse 1 of chapter 27. It says, "Now when morning came, all the chief priests and the elders of the people conferred together against Jesus to put him to death. And they bound him and led him away and delivered him to Pilate the governor. Then when Judas, who had betrayed him, saw that he had been condemned, he felt remorse and returned the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and elders, saying, 'I have sinned by betraying innocent blood.' But they said, 'What is that to us? See to that yourself.' And he threw the pieces of silver into the temple sanctuary and departed. And he went away and he hanged himself." Now, chapter 27 opens with the morning dawning on the daytime Passover, which is Thursday morning. You heard that right, Thursday morning. If you grew up in church like me, we celebrate Good Friday. You get a 3-day weekend. It's church tradition, and you've lived your whole life thinking that Jesus died on a Friday, even though mathematically you know Friday to Sunday isn't 3 days, especially whenever like it talked about him, being in the belly, compared it to that of 3 days and 3 nights. Like, it just doesn't add up. But anyway, you went along with it because there's church tradition. So it was a Thursday, and it's also the year 27 AD. And we'll get into why that is and how that makes sense as we go through the study a little bit later on. Now, you have to understand that the Jews count time sundown to sundown. So Passover began the night before at sundown on Wednesday. On that evening, each family observed a Passover meal. They ate their family lamb. Jesus was with his disciples during the Passover. And the next morning, there would be a daytime Passover, just a single national sacrificial lamb that would be offered in the temple at 9 a.m. Now, very interesting is this lamb would be observed for 4 days to make sure that it was spotless and clean. Jesus arrives in the city on Sunday and goes to the temple to preach, and he preaches in there Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, which is 4 days, and he's tested and, you could say, inspected by the religious leaders. Now, on this year, there would be 2 national sacrifices taking place, one inside the temple and one outside the city. According to Mark's gospel, Jesus was placed on the cross on the 3rd hour, using the Roman system for counting time, or 9 a.m., because Romans started their day at 6 a.m., so you add 3 hours to it, that's how you get 9. So Jesus is nailed on the cross at the same moment that the national lamb died inside the temple, which, again, we'll get into a little bit later, probably next week. So we talked about the Jewish trial of Jesus before Annas and Caiaphas. That takes place overnight. Jesus is beaten at Caiaphas' home. Peter is standing outside denying Jesus, and at the 3rd denial, the rooster crows. Now, I live in the South, so all of us know that a rooster crows just before sunrise, or about 6 a.m. So at this moment, it's just before 6 a.m. on Thursday morning, right around the 1st hour of the Roman day, and in 3 hours, Jesus is going to be on the cross. Jesus has spent the better part of 5 hours in the custody of the Jewish authorities. He's now beaten, bloodied, and it says bound. He's marched from Caiaphas' home in the upper district of Jerusalem to Pilate's residence in the city. And the Jews had to wait until daylight when Pilate was awake and in his office ready. Okay? And normally Pilate lived like 50 miles away in Caesarea, but during major feasts, he would come to Jerusalem to be on hand in case of any unrest in the city. You got to remember, Pilate's primary responsibility was keeping the peace in Judea, and the Romans had learned that ruling over the Jews just wasn't easy. Especially right now, like millions of Jews have flooded into the city and the surrounding area for the Passover. Their feelings of nationalism were running super high right now, and they already had a tendency to riot anyway at the drop of a hat. So now it's just greatly increased. So to keep the peace, Pilate would bring a bunch of additional soldiers to the city. He would set up his headquarters at the Antonian Fortress, which was just a military fort that overlooked the city. And you got to imagine, Pilate's pretty eager to see one prisoner this morning, because during the previous night, the religious leaders, they've gone to Pilate with Judas to accuse Jesus of insurrection. And based on Judas's testimony, Pilate dispatches a cohort of Roman soldiers, which if you're wondering how many that is, it's about 500, to go arrest Jesus that night. So now it's morning. Pilate's expecting to see this prisoner that he sent all the soldiers to go and arrest to see if these charges are true. And that's why the Jewish religious leaders conducted their trial of Jesus overnight, because they knew they had to take him to Pilate on Thursday morning. So they had to do that even though Jewish law prohibited trials at night. So now the Roman trial begins, and once again the Jewish authorities, they're going to look to their boy Judas, expecting him to fill the second part of their bargain. Remember, they needed something more than blasphemy in the Roman court, and that's where Judas is going to come in. He was paid to testify against Jesus before Pilate, saying he sought to be the king of Israel. They didn't need They didn't need Judas at the Jewish trial, because the religious leaders, they could find any number of ways that they wanted to trap Jesus and trump up some charges. It didn't matter. But Judas's testimony would be essential for the Roman trial. But at the very last moment, he gets cold feet. And it says that Judas observes the Jewish trials. And when he hears the verdict, he's kind of like, oh man, I've been manipulated. He recognizes that it's his testimony that's going to be responsible for Jesus' death sentence, and I guess apparently hadn't really thought about that before. I mean, I'm not really sure what he was thinking. Maybe it was the 6 weeks' wages that he was thinking about. Not really sure. And so now the weight of his actions are coming to rest on his shoulders. He feels remorse, and he decides he can't go through with it. Now, some translations use the word repent instead of remorse, but both are a really poor translation. In Greek, there's 2 words in the New Testament that can be used. The first is used when describing a godly repentance, okay, a sincere change of heart. And the second one, well, that describes worldly remorse in response to negative consequences. And I'll let you guess which one is used here when it's talking about Judas. It's the second one. It's the worldly remorse. Judas, he's feeling guilty because he sold out Jesus. He's regretting the consequences that are coming upon Jesus and himself. So he goes to the religious leaders to give back the money, back out of this agreement to testify. Okay? Verse 4, he recants his testimony before the religious leaders and says, hey, Jesus was innocent. And he's expecting that, all right, it's cool. It's cool now. Here's your money back. I'm recanting my testimony. It's going to put a halt to this. It's going to reverse the damage that I've done. And, that's going to be it. But they respond saying, well, what is that to us? In effect, what they're saying is the same thing that Pilate will say to Jesus in John's gospel, which is, what is truth? In other words, they will decide what is true and what is not true, not Judas. And at the end of verse 4, they say, see to that yourself. But a better translation would be, you shall see, meaning you will see this through. They're telling Judas, you're going to testify to Pilate just like you promised to do, just like we paid you to do. And they're also implying a little bit of a threat there. Because if Judas violates his word to them, they have the power to kill him also. I mean, look at what they're doing with Jesus, a sinless, innocent man. It wouldn't take much to put Judas, a conspirer, to death. So the religious leaders, they refuse to allow Judas to back out of this agreement, and they warn him not to change his testimony. And Judas is going to double down. And in verse 5, he throws his money into the temple in protest, and then he leaves. But now Judas faces a dilemma. If he testifies, that will assure the success of the religious leaders in their conspiracy against Jesus, and he's probably going to get attacked by the disciples, or once Jesus is dead, maybe the Jews just kill him anyway, tie off all loose ends, right? On the other hand, if he refuses to testify or recants his testimony on the stand, he knows the Jews are probably going to kill him anyway. So Judas takes the only escape that he can, which is suicide, and he prefers to die by his own hand than to suffer crucifixion or stoning. Now, lots have been written about Judas's remorse and his choice to take his own life, and most of that conjecture just ignores the context here. When we see Judas's situation for what it was, an unbeliever caught in a conspiracy and outfoxed by evil men, then we can understand Judas's response. He was trapped by his own bad choices and forced to choose the lesser of two evils. Listen, Judas was a devil. Jesus said that in John chapter 6. And he just sought to make a quick buck. And he didn't give any thought to the consequences until it was too late. So how can we believers, what can we learn from Judas's experience? Even though he was an unbeliever, I think the lesson here is clear for everybody. You can't compete with evil. If we allow ourselves to be drawn into the evil world, we'll always come out the loser. You just can't compete. Listen, there's always going to be someone that's willing to be more evil than you. And they'll even do so to your detriment. Judas thought that he could play with the sharks here, and look at what it cost him. And let's talk about these religious leaders. They thought that they could play with the Romans, and how'd that work out for them? You know, a few decades after Jesus was crucified, they pushed a little too hard, and the Romans pushed back. And in 70 AD, when they came into the city, they leveled it. They tore down the walls, they tore down the temple.